Okay, let's briefly talk about the implications of prenatal and childhood lead exposure. And because infants or children, they are smaller in size. So because of that, lead tend to be absorbed in their system in larger proportions. And because of that, it seems that infants or young children or children in general are more quote unquote vulnerable to lead exposure. And sometimes this lead exposure, when they were in their mother's womb or during their childhood years, can have all kinds of implications, whether it is behavioral implications, academic performance, or health implications in their adult years. So, previous research have confirmed that prenatal or childhood lead exposure can lead to inattentiveness or being restless in the classroom, and this in turn affects their academic performance. And researchers also reveal that prenatal or childhood lead exposure can lead to increased homicide rates in a given location. And researchers also confirm that prenatal and childhood lead exposure can lead to increased propensity to criminal behaviors and arrests. And you can Google this article if you want. And researchers also confirm that prenatal and childhood lead exposure can increase STI rates in different census tracts. So, as we can see, prenatal or childhood lead exposure can lead to all kinds of detrimental outcomes in the teenage years, during the adulthood years, and sometimes all these implications can even carry forward to old age. And the contribution of this recent research says that it's not just prenatal or childhood exposure to lead per se. It also has something to do with the age of the homes in different neighborhoods that can determine one's propensity to prenatal and childhood lead exposure. So that's the contribution of this recent study. They took the age of the homes in a given neighborhood, I think in Missouri, if I remember correctly, into consideration when they attempted to analyze prenatal and childhood lead exposure. So, we've been through this many times. A person's education, a person's income and wealth, a person's type of job, whether it's stable, it's permanent, or it's contract with no insurance, no benefit, and other opportunities the person is given in life determines where the person is going to live. And some neighborhoods have newer renovated homes than other neighborhoods. Some neighborhoods are poorer and they have dilapidated homes. So, as you can see, our individual socio-economic characteristics like education, income, occupation, and other opportunities afforded to us determines where we are going to live. And some neighborhoods are newer, or they are being gentrified. And some neighborhoods, they tend to be older, people tend to be poorer, and they tend to be underdeveloped. And homes in those neighborhoods tend to be older and dilapidated. All these factors in turn is going to determine the person's risk for prenatal and childhood lead exposure. And this, as we saw from the previous slide, can lead to all kinds of detrimental outcomes in school success, in behavioral outcomes like violent behaviors, crime, aggressiveness, or STI. And these three articles talks about the epigenetics of lead exposure. And these researchers found that prenatal or childhood lead exposure can affect the fetal epigenome, and this in turn reduce the amounts of gray matter in a person's physical system. And we know gray matters are the neural tissues in our central nervous system, and this in turn affects a person's ability to route sensory and stimulus to the central nervous system. All these ultimately lead to cognitive deficits in the person, in the child. And because of that, sometimes we see maybe a child is not doing very well in school, and sometimes it's not due to the child, the student, not trying hard enough. Maybe we have to go way back to how the person grew up, whether his or her mother was exposed to lead while she was pregnant, as you can see from this diagram. So, in other words, sometimes a student is not performing at his or her best. Sometimes this may due to factors beyond the person's control. And because of that, it is very important for those pursuing a career in counseling or school psychologist or even different kinds of therapy related career to have a basic understanding of the epigenetics of lead exposure. So this article also talks about the epigenetics of lead exposure. And according to researchers from this article, prenatal or childhood lead exposure can affect the activity of protein phosphates. And we know protein phosphates are responsible for the signaling pathways in our system. And this in turn affects the person's ability to regulate synaptic plasticity. And synaptic plasticity is responsible for communication between neurons. And this in turn or ultimately affects a person's memory system. And because of that, maybe a student seemed to be underperforming, and we got to trace back to how the person grew up, what the person's family life was like, in what neighborhood the person grew up, whether the person was exposed to lead or not. I think this information is very important for counselors, school psychologists, and even therapists to know. And a person's memory system can also mean or imply a person's ability to retain certain kinds of memory. So, Because of that, it is very important to minimize lead exposure from a very early age or even way before a person is born.